Sarah Martinez had been looking forward to this flight for months. The 32-year-old marketing executive from Chicago was finally taking her dream vacation to Greece, something she had saved up for over 2 years. She clutched her boarding pass tightly as she made her way down the narrow aisle of the Boeing 737, scanning the seat numbers above her head. Row 12, Seat C. Perfect. A window seat on the left side of the aircraft, just where she had requested. Sarah squeezed past a businessman, already settled in the aisle seat, and slipped into her spot. The middle seat remained empty, which felt like a small victory on such a packed flight. As the plane filled up around her, Sarah organized her carry-on items. She pulled out her neck pillow, a romance novel she had been meaning to finish, and her noise-canceling headphones. The flight from Chicago to Athens was going to be long, with a brief stopover in Amsterdam, but she was determined to make the most of it. The businessman beside her introduced himself as David, a software consultant, heading to a conference in Amsterdam. They exchanged pleasantries about their destinations before Sarah settled back into her seat. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, but Sarah barely paid attention. She had flown dozens of times for work and knew the routine by heart. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Sarah gazed out the small oval window at the bustling activity of O'Hare Airport. Ground crews scurried around like ants, loading luggage and directing aircraft. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, painting everything in shades of gold and orange. The engines roared to life, and Sarah felt the familiar pressure pushing her back into her seat as they accelerated down the runway. Within moments, they were airborne, climbing steadily through the clouds. Chicago grew smaller below them until it disappeared entirely beneath a blanket of white. Sarah had always found takeoffs oddly comforting. There was something peaceful about leaving the ground, about watching the world shrink away beneath her. It felt like all her problems and responsibilities were getting smaller too, at least temporarily. Once they reached cruising altitude, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom with the usual welcome message. He introduced himself as Captain Thompson, mentioned their flight time of approximately 8 hours to Amsterdam, and warned of some possible turbulence over the Atlantic. Sarah adjusted her seatbelt and opened her book. The first few hours passed quietly. Dinner service came and went, and Sarah managed to eat most of her chicken and rice meal despite the typical airplane food complaints from other passengers. David beside her worked on his laptop for a while before eventually closing it and pulling out a magazine. As the sun set outside her window, painting the sky in brilliant purples and pinks, Sarah felt her eyelids growing heavy. The steady hum of the engines and the gentle vibration of the aircraft created a surprisingly soothing environment. She reclined her seat slightly, pulled her blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes. Sleep came easily at 35,000 feet. Sarah drifted off thinking about the Greek islands she would visit, the ancient ruins she would explore, and the crystal-clear waters where she planned to swim. Her breathing became deep and rhythmic, matching the steady drone of the engines. The cabin lights had been dimmed for the overnight portion of the flight, and most passengers had settled in for the long journey ahead. Flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, checking on sleeping passengers and clearing away the remnants of dinner service. Sarah slept peacefully for several hours, her head resting against the small pillow she had wedged between her seat and the window. In her dreams, she was already walking through the narrow streets of Santorini, the white buildings gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. But somewhere high above the Atlantic Ocean, in the darkness of the early morning hours, something was about to go very wrong. In the cockpit, Captain Thompson was dealing with a situation that no commercial pilot ever wants to face. His co-pilot, First Officer Martinez, had suddenly become very ill. It had started as a mild headache during dinner service, but now the younger pilot was experiencing severe chest pains and difficulty breathing. Captain Thompson had immediately contacted medical personnel on the ground, but the symptoms were getting worse by the minute. The captain knew he had to make a decision quickly. They were still hours away from Amsterdam, flying over the vast emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean with no nearby airports for an emergency landing. His co-pilot was clearly in distress, possibly having a heart attack, and Captain Thompson was facing the terrifying possibility of having to handle the landing entirely on his own. Captain Thompson's hands gripped the controls tighter as he watched his co-pilot struggle to breathe. First Officer Martinez was clearly in serious medical distress, clutching his chest and sweating profusely despite the cool temperature in the cockpit. The captain had been flying commercial aircraft for over 20 years, but this was uncharted territory. He quickly activated the emergency medical frequency on his radio, connecting directly with a physician on the ground who specialized in in-flight medical emergencies. After describing the symptoms, the doctor's voice crackled through the headset with grim news. It appeared the co-pilot was experiencing a major cardiac event and needed immediate medical attention. The problem was that they were currently flying over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, more than 3 hours from the nearest airport. Captain Thompson faced an agonizing decision. He could declare an emergency and attempt to divert to Iceland or Greenland, but the weather report showed severe storms in both areas. Landing in those conditions with an incapacitated co-pilot would be extremely dangerous. His other option was to continue toward Amsterdam, where the weather was clear and the airport facilities were excellent. But that meant First Officer Martinez would have to wait several more hours for medical attention, and his condition was clearly deteriorating. While Captain Thompson weighed these impossible choices, he realized he needed to prepare for the worst-case scenario. What if his co-pilot became completely unconscious? What if he himself became incapacitated? Flying a modern commercial aircraft was typically a two-person job, especially during critical phases like landing. That's when he remembered something from his training manual. In extreme emergencies, commercial pilots were authorized to request assistance from any qualified pilots who might be traveling as passengers. It was an incredibly rare procedure, something that happened maybe once or twice a decade across all airlines worldwide. Captain Thompson knew the statistics. In a plane carrying 180 passengers, the chances of having another commercial pilot on board were actually quite good. Many pilots traveled frequently for work or vacation, often flying on other airlines when they were off duty. But first, he needed to get his co-pilot medical attention. The lead flight attendant, Jennifer Walsh, had been quietly notified of the situation and was already preparing the first-class cabin to serve as a makeshift medical area. She had also identified 2 passengers who had identified themselves as medical professionals during boarding. Dr. Susan Chen, a cardiologist from Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and Dr. Michael Roberts, an emergency room physician from Boston. Dr. Chen was sleeping in seat 3A when Jennifer gently shook her awake. The cardiologist immediately understood the gravity of the situation when Jennifer explained what was happening in the cockpit. Within minutes, both doctors were making their way toward the front of the aircraft, carrying the plane's emergency medical kit. The first-class passengers watched with growing concern as the flight attendants quickly cleared an area and helped the co-pilot out of the cockpit. First Officer Martinez was conscious but clearly in severe pain, his face pale and his breathing labored. Dr. Chen immediately began her examination while Dr. Roberts prepared medications from the emergency medical kit. Their preliminary assessment confirmed Captain Thompson's worst fears. The co-pilot was indeed experiencing a major heart attack and was in no condition to return to the cockpit. As the doctors worked to stabilize First Officer Martinez, Captain Thompson remained at the controls, flying the aircraft manually to maintain their course toward Amsterdam. But he knew he couldn't continue like this for much longer. The approach and landing procedures were complex and typically required constant communication and coordination between both pilots. The cabin remained mostly quiet, with most passengers still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the drama unfolding in the front of the aircraft. Sarah Martinez continued to sleep soundly in row 12, her head still resting against the window, completely oblivious to the fact that she shared a last name with the incapacitated co-pilot. Captain Thompson made his decision. He picked up the intercom microphone, knowing that his next announcement would likely wake most of the sleeping passengers and potentially cause panic. But he had no choice. He needed to know if there were any qualified pilots on board who could assist him with the landing. He cleared his throat and spoke in the calmest voice he could manage, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether this flight ended safely or became a tragedy that would make international headlines. The captain's voice cut through the quiet hum of the aircraft engines like a knife. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Thompson speaking. I apologize for waking those of you who were sleeping, but I need to make an important announcement. We are currently experiencing a medical emergency in the cockpit, and I need to ask if there are any qualified commercial pilots traveling as passengers today who might be able to assist us." Sarah's eyes snapped open instantly. The captain's words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment she wondered if she was still dreaming. But the concerned murmur of voices throughout the cabin quickly confirmed that this was very real. She sat up straight in her seat, her heart beginning to race. Around her, other passengers were waking up, looking confused and alarmed. David, the businessman beside her, was already fully alert, his laptop forgotten as he stared toward the front of the aircraft. "Did he just ask for a pilot?" David whispered. The captain continued, his voice steady but with an underlying urgency that made Sarah's stomach clench with anxiety. "If you are a licensed commercial pilot, please press your call button immediately and identify yourself to the flight attendant. This is a serious request and we would appreciate your assistance." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah found herself holding her breath, along with what seemed like every other passenger on the plane. She could hear people shifting in their seats, the rustle of blankets and hushed conversations as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the aircraft, came the soft ding of a call button. Sarah craned her neck to see over the seats in front of her, watching as a flight attendant hurried down the aisle toward the sound. A few rows ahead and across the aisle, she could see a man in his 50s raising his hand. The flight attendant reached him quickly, and Sarah could hear fragments of their quiet conversation. The man was speaking in a calm, professional tone, and she caught words like airline, certification, and experience. Within moments, the flight attendant was escorting him toward the front of the aircraft. Relief seemed to ripple through the cabin as passengers realized that help was available. But Sarah noticed that the flight attendant looked tense, and there seemed to be continued activity in the first-class section. Whatever was happening up there was clearly serious. The man who had responded was Captain James Mitchell, a 28-year veteran pilot for Delta Airlines who was traveling to Amsterdam for a well-deserved vacation with his wife. He had been sleeping, fitfully, when Captain Thompson's announcement woke him, and he didn't hesitate for even a second before pressing his call button. As Captain Mitchell made his way toward the cockpit, he could see the medical emergency unfolding in the first-class cabin. First Officer Martinez was lying across two seats with both doctors working over him. An oxygen mask covered his face, and Dr. Chen was monitoring his heart rhythm on a small portable device from the emergency medical kit. "How's he doing?" "Captain," Mitchell asked Dr. Chen as he paused beside them. "Stable for now, but he needs to get to a hospital as soon as possible," she replied without looking up. "He's had a significant heart attack, and while we've managed his pain and given him some medication to help his heart rhythm, he's not out of danger." Captain Mitchell nodded grimly and continued toward the cockpit where Captain Thompson was waiting for him. The two pilots quickly introduced themselves, and Captain Thompson briefed his colleague on the situation. First Officer Martinez had become ill about an hour earlier, and his condition had deteriorated rapidly. "I can handle the flying," Captain Thompson explained, "but I need someone qualified to handle the co-pilot duties during approach and landing. Are you current on the 737? Captain Mitchell nodded. "I fly the 737-800 series regularly, same cockpit. Layout, same procedures. When do we land?" "About 2.5 hours. Amsterdam is reporting clear skies and calm winds, so conditions should be good." Captain Thompson paused, looking at his experienced colleague. "I have to ask, though, when was your last flight as pilot in command?" 3 days ago, Chicago to Los Angeles," Captain Mitchell replied confidently. "I'm completely current on all my certifications, and I've logged over 15,000 hours in Boeing aircraft." The relief in Captain Thompson's voice was unmistakable. "Thank God you're on this flight." Back in the cabin, Sarah was trying to process what was happening. She had always been a nervous flyer, despite her frequent business trips, and the captain's announcement had triggered every anxiety she had about air travel. She found herself gripping the armrests of her seat, her knuckles white with tension. David. noticed her distress and offered her a reassuring smile. "Hey, it sounds like they found a pilot to help. These guys train for situations like this all the time." Sarah nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. "I know. I just never imagined something like this could actually happen." Other passengers throughout the cabin were having similar conversations. Some were calling family members despite the early hour, while others were trying to get more information from the flight attendants. The crew was doing their best to keep everyone calm, while managing the ongoing medical emergency in first class. In the cockpit, Captain Mitchell was quickly familiarizing himself with the specific instruments and systems of this particular 737. While the basic layout was identical to the aircraft he flew regularly, there were always subtle differences between individual planes and airlines. He adjusted the seat height, tested the radio controls, and reviewed the approach charts for Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport. Captain Thompson had radioed ahead to Amsterdam Air Traffic Control, declaring a medical emergency and requesting priority landing clearance. The controllers immediately began clearing other aircraft from their approach path and notified emergency medical services to be standing by on the ground. "How's our fuel situation?" Captain Mitchell asked as he completed his pre-landing checks. "We're good. We have enough for a normal approach plus about an hour of reserve," Captain Thompson replied. "Weather is holding steady, visibility is excellent, and we're cleared for a straight-in approach to runway 36L. Both men had decades of experience in aviation, but this situation was unlike anything either had faced before. They worked together smoothly, their training and professionalism taking over as they prepared for one of the most critical landings of their careers. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, First Officer Martinez's condition had stabilized somewhat under the care of the two doctors. Dr. Chen had established an IV line and was monitoring his vital signs continuously, while Dr. Roberts was in constant communication with the medical team on the ground via the aircraft's satellite phone system. "His blood pressure is stabilizing and the chest pain seems to be subsiding," Dr. Chen reported to the lead flight attendant. "But he absolutely needs to get to a cardiac catheterization lab as soon as we land. Every minute counts with this type of heart attack." Jennifer Walsh, the senior flight attendant, was coordinating between the cockpit, the medical team, and the ground controllers. She had over 15 years of experience in aviation, but managing a medical emergency at 35,000 feet while keeping 178 passengers calm was testing all of her skills. She made another announcement to the cabin, her voice deliberately calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to update you on our situation. We do have a qualified pilot assisting our captain, and we will be making a priority landing in Amsterdam in approximately 2 hours. Emergency medical personnel will be waiting on the ground. For your safety, we ask that you remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll keep you informed of any developments." Sarah felt slightly better after hearing the update, but she still couldn't shake her anxiety. She had always been superstitious about flying, and something about this situation felt different from the routine mechanical problems or weather delays she had experienced before. This involved human lives in immediate danger. She tried to distract herself by looking out the window, but all she could see was the vast darkness of the Atlantic Ocean below. Somewhere down there, thousands of feet below the aircraft, ships were probably going about their normal business, completely unaware of the drama playing out in the sky above them. David was trying to work on his laptop, but Sarah noticed he kept glancing toward the front of the aircraft. "Do you think they'll tell us what happened?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Sarah replied. "I just hope everyone's okay." Throughout the cabin, passengers were dealing with the stress in different ways. Some were trying to sleep, others were reading or watching movies on their devices, and a few were quietly praying. The normally social atmosphere of a long international flight had been replaced by a tense, watchful quiet. In row 23, retired Nurse Patricia Williams had identified herself to the flight attendants as additional medical support if needed. She had worked in cardiac units for over 30 years and understood exactly how serious the co-pilot's condition was. She remained ready to assist if called upon, though she hoped the two doctors would be sufficient. Captain Mitchell was now fully integrated into the cockpit operations, handling radio communications and monitoring the aircraft systems while Captain Thompson focused on flying. They were working together as if they had been a crew for years, their shared training and experience creating an instant professional partnership. Amsterdam approach. This is Flight 447 Heavy. We're approximately 150 miles southeast of your position, requesting priority handling for medical emergency. Captain Mitchell radioed to the approach controllers. Flight 447 Heavy, Amsterdam approach. You are cleared direct to the airport. Descend and maintain flight level 240. Medical emergency. Equipment is standing by. How many souls on board and fuel remaining? 180 souls on board, approximately 2 hours fuel remaining. Captain Mitchell responded, using the aviation terminology that always struck passengers as oddly formal, but was standard in emergency situations, as they began their initial descent toward Amsterdam. Both pilots knew that the most challenging part of their ordeal was still ahead of them. Landing any commercial aircraft was a complex procedure requiring precise coordination. But doing it under emergency conditions with an unfamiliar crew member added layers of difficulty that even their extensive training had never fully prepared them for. As the aircraft began its descent toward Amsterdam, the tension in the cabin was almost tangible. Sarah could feel her ears popping as they lost altitude, and she noticed that many passengers had stopped pretending to read or sleep. Everyone seemed to be listening intently to every sound, every change in the engine noise, every crackle from the intercom system. The descent was actually going smoothly from a technical standpoint. Captain Thompson and Captain Mitchell had settled into an effective rhythm, with Mitchell handling most of the radio communications and system monitoring, while Thompson focused on the precise flying required for the approach. Their decades of combined experience were showing as they worked together seamlessly. Flight 447 Heavy, you're cleared for the ILS approach to runway 36L. Wind is calm. Visibility is 15 kilometers. Altimeter is 30.12. Emergency vehicles are in position, came the voice of the Amsterdam approach controller. Roger, cleared for the ILS 36L approach, 3012 set. Captain Mitchell responded. He turned to Captain Thompson. All emergency checklists are complete. Aircraft is configured and ready for landing. In the first-class cabin, Dr. Chen was monitoring First Officer Martinez's condition closely. His vital signs had remained relatively stable during the descent, but she knew that the stress of landing and the continued delay in getting him to proper medical facilities was not helping his situation. How much longer? She asked Jennifer, the lead flight attendant. About 20 minutes until we're on the ground, then probably another 10 minutes to get to the gate where the paramedics are waiting, Jennifer replied. Dr. Chen nodded, continuing to monitor the portable cardiac monitor that showed the co-pilot's heart rhythm. The medication they had given him was helping, but she could see signs that another cardiac event was possible. Every minute that passed increased the risk of permanent heart damage. Captain Mitchell's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the pilot assisting your captain today. We are beginning our final approach to Amsterdam. The weather is excellent, and we expect a very smooth landing. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and your seats are in the upright position. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing. Sarah gripped her armrests tighter as she felt the aircraft bank slightly to line up with the runway. Through her window, she could finally see lights. Below them, the sprawling illumination of Amsterdam stretching out in all directions. It was still dark outside, but the approaching dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern horizon. The landing gear deployed with the usual mechanical rumble and clunk that always made Sarah nervous, even on normal flights. Tonight, every sound seemed amplified, every vibration more noticeable. She found herself holding her breath as the runway lights became visible ahead of them. In the cockpit, both pilots were completely focused on the approach. Captain Thompson had his hands on the controls, making minute adjustments to keep the aircraft perfectly aligned with the runway centerline. Captain Mitchell was calling out altitudes, airspeeds, and other critical information. 500 feet, on glide. Path airspeed good, Mitchell called out. Runway in sight continuing, Thompson replied, his voice steady despite the pressure. 100 feet, 50 feet, 40, 30, 20, 10. Mitchell counted down the altitude as the runway rushed up to meet them. The main landing gear touched down smoothly, followed immediately by the nose gear. Captain Thompson deployed the thrust reversers and applied the brakes, bringing the large aircraft to a controlled stop. The landing was so smooth that several passengers actually applauded despite the circumstances. "Nice job," Captain Mitchell said quietly to his colleague as they began the post-landing procedures. "Couldn't have done it without you," Captain Thompson replied, the relief evident in his voice for the first time all night. As soon as they reached the gate, the aircraft door opened and paramedics rushed aboard. Dr. Chen quickly briefed them on First Officer Martinez's condition and the treatment that had been provided during the flight. Within minutes, the co-pilot was being wheeled off the aircraft on a stretcher, conscious and stable, but clearly still in need of immediate cardiac intervention. The passengers watched through the windows as the ambulance raced away from the gate, its lights flashing in the early morning darkness. There was a somber quality to the moment as everyone realized how serious the situation had been. Captain Thompson's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have safely arrived in Amsterdam. I want to thank Captain Mitchell, who volunteered to assist us during this emergency, as well as the medical professionals who cared for our crew member. Thanks to their expertise and professionalism, we were able to handle this situation safely." Sarah finally felt her shoulders relax for the first time in hours. As passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark, she realized that she had just experienced something that most people would never encounter in a lifetime of flying. She had been part of a real aviation emergency, and thanks to the skill and dedication of multiple people, everyone had made it safely to the ground. As passengers slowly filed off the aircraft at Amsterdam's Schiphol airport, the atmosphere was unlike any normal flight arrival. Instead of the usual complaints about delays or the rush to catch connecting flights, people were talking quietly among themselves about what they had just experienced. Many were exchanging contact information, bonded by their shared experience of the emergency. Sarah gathered her belongings slowly, still processing everything that had happened. The romance novel she had planned to read lay forgotten in her carry-on bag, its bookmark still marking the same page where she had left off when she fell asleep hours earlier. So much had changed during those few hours over the Atlantic Ocean. As she walked up the jet bridge, Sarah could see Captain Thompson standing near the gate, talking with airport officials and what appeared to be airline management personnel. He looked tired but relieved, occasionally glancing back toward the aircraft where maintenance crews were already beginning their inspection. Captain Mitchell was there too, still in his casual vacation clothes but somehow carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of a professional pilot. His wife, Margaret, had been waiting anxiously at the gate after being notified of the situation by airline personnel. She embraced her husband tightly, clearly understanding how significant his role had been in the safe outcome. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered to him as other passengers walked past, many nodding their thanks to the man who had volunteered to help during their crisis. Near the medical station in the terminal, Dr. Susan Chen was providing a final briefing to the paramedics who had taken over First Officer Martinez's care. She had accompanied them to the hospital to ensure continuity of care, and the early reports were encouraging. The co-pilot had been taken directly to the cardiac catheterization lab, where specialists were working to restore blood flow to his heart. "He's young and otherwise healthy," Dr. Chen explained to Captain Thompson when she returned to the airport, an hour later. "If we hadn't been there to provide immediate care during the flight, the outcome could have been very different, but the doctors at the hospital are optimistic about his recovery." The relief on Captain Thompson's face was evident. In all his years of flying, he had never lost a crew member, and he had been terrified that First Officer Martinez might not survive the flight. The young pilot had a wife and 2 small children back in Chicago, and Captain Thompson had been dreading the possibility of having to deliver devastating news to them. Sarah was sitting in the departure lounge, waiting for her rescheduled connection to Athens when she overheard Captain Mitchell talking to a group of passengers who had approached him. They wanted to thank him personally for his actions during the emergency. "I just did what any pilot would do," he said modestly. "We all train for situations like this, even though we hope we never have to use that training. Captain Thompson did the hard work. I just helped with the procedures." One of the passengers, an elderly woman who had been traveling to visit her grandchildren, shook his hand warmly. You saved all of our lives tonight. Don't minimize what you did. David, the businessman who had been sitting next to Sarah, was already on his phone with his office explaining why he would be late to his conference. But before he left for his hotel, he stopped by Sarah's seat. That was something else, wasn't it? He said. Makes you think about what's really important in life. Sarah nodded, thinking about her own priorities. The vacation she had saved so hard for suddenly seemed less important than the fact that she was alive and safe on the ground. She had been planning to call her sister when she arrived in Athens, but instead she pulled out her phone and called her right then, despite the early hour. Sarah, is everything okay? It's so early. Her sister's sleepy voice came through the phone. I'm fine, Lisa. I just wanted to tell you that I love you, Sarah said, her voice catching slightly. I'll explain later, but I just realized I don't tell you that often enough. Throughout the terminal, similar conversations were taking place. The emergency had reminded everyone on board of their mortality and the importance of the relationships in their lives. Passengers were calling family members, sending messages to friends, and making mental notes to prioritize what truly mattered when they returned home. Captain Thompson finally finished his debriefing with airline officials and airport authorities. The aircraft would be thoroughly inspected before returning to service, and there would be a comprehensive investigation into the incident. But the preliminary assessment was that everyone had acted professionally and appropriately under extremely challenging circumstances. As he walked through the terminal toward his hotel, Captain Thompson reflected on the night's events. In 30 seconds, his routine flight had transformed into a life-or-death situation that required split-second decisions and flawless execution. He thought about First Officer Martinez, who was still fighting for his life in a hospital across the city, and about Captain Mitchell, who had stepped up without hesitation when asked. But mostly he thought about the 178 passengers who had trusted him to get them safely to their destination. They had fallen asleep in row 12 and throughout the cabin, expecting nothing more than a routine overnight flight. Instead, they had experienced something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The sun was finally rising over Amsterdam as Sarah boarded her connection to Athens. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, she looked out the window at the same type of Boeing 737 that had brought her safely through the night. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid during takeoff. She had learned something profound about the dedication and skill of the people who made aviation possible, and she would never take a safe landing for granted again. First Officer Martinez would eventually make a full recovery and return to flying 6 months later. Captain Mitchell received a commendation from the airline and continued his vacation, as planned. And Sarah? She had the trip of a lifetime in Greece, but she never forgot the night when a simple question from the captain changed everything for everyone in row 12 and beyond.